There were some football fans that went hiking up a mountain one day. There was a Bears fan, a Lions fan, a Vikings fan, and a Packers fan. And as they were climbing up this mountain, they were arguing about who loved their team the most. And their argument got pretty intense, and after a while, the Bears fan insisted that he was the most loyal to his team. And to prove it, he yelled, "This is for the Bears!" and he jumped off the mountain. Not to be outdone, the Lions fan shouted, "Well, this is for the Lions!" and he jumped off the mountain too. Well, it was the Packers' turn next, and their fan didn't want to be outdone. So to profess his love for his team, he yelled, "This is for everyone!" and he shoved the Vikings fan off the mountain. Did you know that the average team in the National Football League employs over 3,500 people? I just learned that this week. And each of those 3,500 people has a part to play in the organization, but only a few of them are people that we would recognize by name or by sight. Most notably, among the ones that we would recognize, are the quarterbacks. Even if you don't care about football, you've probably heard the name Tom Brady or Aaron Rodgers, and that's because those are quarterbacks in the NFL, and they're two of the most famous quarterbacks in the league right now. But there's more to quarterbacks than just how recognizable they are. Quarterbacks also make more money than anyone else in the NFL. Now, part of that is because they touch the ball on almost every single play. But I think that more importantly, it's because quarterbacks in the NFL are looked at as leaders of their teams. Quarterbacks who can throw the ball really well but can't lead very well, they don't turn out to be great quarterbacks. Leadership is an essential part of playing quarterback in the National Football League. Now, I think the most easily recognized reason for this is because the quarterback is the one who calls the play as the team huddles up. Everyone else on the offense has to listen to the quarterback if they want to know what they're supposed to do. But beyond that, quarterbacks also do a lot to set the tone for the team, both in practice and in games. And quarterbacks are so significant to their teams that entire team stats are attributed just to the quarterback. You can easily look up on a reference site any quarterback's career wins and losses. Even though the quarterback didn't win or lose on their own, they get that as one of their stats. But nobody cares about the career wins and losses of the punter or the tight end. It's just the quarterback. That's because, once again, leadership is a key element to playing quarterback in the NFL. And that leadership impacts the whole team. Let's imagine for a second, though, a quarterback wasn't a good leader. Imagine that he comes to the huddle and he calls the wrong play. And then they go to the line of scrimmage and the team isn't all on the same page, so the play doesn't work. Or imagine he doesn't call a play at all, so nobody knows what to do. Or imagine that he's trying to lead well, and he calls the play that he's supposed to, but nobody respects him, so nobody listens to him, and when they get up to the line of scrimmage, they all do their own thing. In any one of those situations, that team is not going to be successful. So it's no wonder the Vikings are always so bad. Well, this morning we're going to talk about leadership, but not in the NFL. I could talk about the NFL a long time, but this is church, so we're going to talk about leadership in church. Just like a football team needs someone to be a leader in order for them to be successful, the church needs leaders as well. And that's what Peter has to say in 1 Peter chapter 5, verses 1 through 5. So if you open your Bible there and read along with me, we'll see what it is that Peter has to say about leadership in the church. So 1 Peter chapter 5, verses 1 through 5. So I exhort the elders among you, as a fellow elder and a witness of the sufferings of Christ, as well as a partaker in the glory that is going to be revealed. Shepherd the flock of God that is among you, exercising oversight, not under compulsion, but willingly, as God would have you. Not for shameful gain, but eagerly. Not domineering over those in your charge, but being examples to the flock. And when the chief shepherd appears, you will receive the unfading crown of glory. Likewise, you who are younger, be subject to the elders. Clothe yourselves, all of you, with humility toward one another. For God opposes the proud, but gives grace to the humble. Now, I think there are 3 sections in this passage, and each is addressed to a different group. It begins with church leaders or elders, and then it moves on to church followers, or as I'll call them, youngers instead of elders. And then it finally addresses everyone. And by the time we get to that everyone, that will include the leaders and the followers, the elders and the youngers. And that final instruction, it really helps to make everything work between those leaders and those who follow. But the majority of the paragraph is directed to elders, and so that's where we'll start. There's actually 3 words in this paragraph that are commonly used to describe leaders in the New Testament. There are elders, there's also the word shepherd and the word oversight. Shepherd and oversight in this passage are both put into a verb form, but the noun form of each of those is used to describe a leader in the church throughout the New Testament. So this starts with instructions for church leaders. Now, some of this instruction will be applicable specifically to those serving in the role of an elder, and some of it will be applicable more broadly to any leadership in the church. And really, some of it applies to leadership in any context, in the church or in the broader world around us. So the first instructions here are the ones that are most specifically to elders. Not a lot of other people need this instruction. It says, shepherd the flock of God that is among you, exercising oversight. Shepherding and exercising oversight are specifically tasks for elders in the church. It's not that no one else would ever do these things, but this is specifically what is expected of an elder in the church. Shepherding is leading, it's guiding and feeding and directing. It really draws a lot from an actual shepherd, what he does for a flock of sheep. And then exercising oversight, I think, is paying attention to people and what they're going through and the influences that are impacting their lives, to understand them as you oversee them. I think you can see a picture of this in another context that I think may be instructive for us to understand what's going on. At our house, Caleb has been watching and listening to VeggieTales. He's particularly interested in the Silly Songs with Larry. For good reason, they're pretty good. VeggieTales is, of course, a fine influence for Caleb, and Silly Songs with Larry is harmless. There's nothing wrong with him listening to that. But there's been a problem for us in our house. The problem is that the Silly Songs with Larry, we try to find them online, and they're not on Amazon Music, which is what I usually stream music on. So we found them someplace else. We found them on Pandora. But because I don't use Pandora very often, I'm usually on Amazon, I don't know how it works as well. And so something happens that I don't understand. Caleb will start listening to Silly Songs with Larry, but after a period of time, Pandora stops playing what he's selected and starts playing something else. And I don't know how on earth Pandora decides what to switch it to, but let me tell you what happened on Friday night. Caleb fell asleep listening to Silly Songs with Larry. And I came back to check on him a while later, and Pandora was playing music by the artist 50 Cent. If you don't know who that is, that's not someone that's appropriate for 6-year-olds to listen to as they're falling asleep. So functioning as an overseer in Caleb's life would mean that I need to be aware of that influence, and I need to find a way to correct it. This is what elders and shepherds and overseers in the church should be doing for the people in their church. Paying attention to the influences in people's lives and the circumstances that they're in, and providing help, direction, and teaching that's relevant to them, as well as correcting the influences that come from the world around. I think this is especially important when a church is facing persecution and suffering, like the churches that Peter was addressing in this letter. Oversight and shepherding are often more important to us when we're facing suffering. It can be easy to do the right thing when things are going well. But when things aren't going well, many of us could use a little help and a little guidance. When we are suffering, most of us want to be able to talk to someone who can listen well. And when we get to the point where we're ready to hear it, we want them to be able, more than just comfort, we want them to be able to offer advice and direction. Now, of course, there are some applications of these initial instructions that are beyond the tasks of recognized elders and leaders in the church. And to some degree, anyone can do these things at times, but Peter's emphasis here is to address elders directly. And Peter will keep that emphasis through the next set of instructions, but these instructions are much more broadly applicable, I think. I think that these next verses are valid instructions to anyone in a position of leadership, whether in the church or in the home, in the workforce, or in the community. Peter directs elders to exercise their leadership willingly rather than under compulsion, and eagerly rather than for shameful gain. I think that no one should be in a leadership position just because they've been compelled to be there, whether in the church or otherwise. And leaders, I don't think, should do it just for the money. The best leaders are the ones who want to be there. The movie Top Gun, Maverick, is playing at the Playhouse Theater this weekend. It was there last weekend too. And I think in that movie we see an example of this concept in a military context. Maverick, who's played by Tom Cruise, is a captain in the Navy. But it's pointed out that with his record, he should have been able to be a higher ranking officer by this point in his career. But Maverick didn't want to be in a different position. He didn't want to be compelled to serve in a leadership position that he wasn't eager to be in. And he didn't pursue a higher rank for the increase in pay that would have come with that either. No, Maverick thought of himself as a fighter pilot, not as a leader. Now, in the movie, he was compelled to lead and to teach for a time, and he did serve admirably in that role, but ultimately, Maverick was a pilot, not a teacher or a leader. I experienced something similar in my own time in the Army. Increasing in rank results in an increase in pay and an increase in responsibility and leadership. But I didn't really want to be a leader in that context. I wanted the higher pay, but I thought I was a better soldier in the role that I was currently in than I would have been in the role of a higher ranking officer. Thankfully for me, that didn't really come into play as I completed the time of service that I signed up for before I would have had to decide if I wanted to keep climbing the ranks or if it was best for me to stay in the role that I was in. And I'm glad I didn't have to make that decision because I would have probably felt pressure to continue to climb through those ranks, even though I didn't necessarily feel qualified to do the things associated with those ranks. And all of this is applicable in our churches as well. Anyone who serves in the church should be doing it willingly and in accordance with their gifting and their calling from God. But there are those who pursue leadership in the church for other reasons. Some do it for money, which to me seems like a pretty bad way to get rich, but some people have made it work. Don't think they should have, but they have. Others do it because they feel like their parents or their peers want them to do it, even though they don't want to. Others might do it because the church sees them as fitting a leadership role that they might not actually be qualified for. I've heard of plenty of bankers who end up on church boards as treasurers because of their work in the bank, but not because of their gifting or calling from God. Now, this isn't to say that no one should be paid to be a leader in the church. 1 Corinthians 9:14 says that the Lord commanded that those who proclaim the gospel should get their living by the gospel. And Galatians 6:6 says, let the one who is taught the word share all good things with the one who teaches. So not all pastors, elders, or church leaders receive pay from the churches they serve, but having paid leaders does allow those leaders to dedicate more time to the tasks that they are called to perform. But from there, Peter gives one final piece of instruction for elders, which is probably, in my opinion, the most important one of them all. He says that elders should be examples for the churches and not be domineering. Their leadership should be by example and not through force or coercion. Once again, this is great leadership advice for anyone, whether in the church or otherwise. Along those lines, I want to focus on the example of Peter himself. He is, in fact, I think, leading by example as he writes this very passage. At the beginning of the letter, Peter calls himself an apostle, but here he calls himself an elder because he wants the people he is writing to be able to relate to his own experiences and his example. As a part of his example, Peter brings up his role as a witness of the sufferings of Christ. But I think it's good for us to remember what was going on while Peter was witnessing the sufferings of Christ. In John 18, we find John's account of the arrest and trial of Jesus, which was, of course, a significant part of his sufferings. And in that chapter, verses 15 through 18 and then 25 through 27 show us Peter's involvement in these events. John 18:15 says, Simon Peter followed Jesus, and so did another disciple. Since that disciple was known to the high priest, he entered with Jesus into the courtyard of the high priest. But Peter stood outside at the door. So the other disciple, who was known to the high priest, went out and spoke to the servant girl who kept watch at the door, and brought Peter in. The servant girl at the door said to Peter, You also are not one of this man's disciples, are you? He said, I am not. Now the servants and officers had made a charcoal fire because it was cold, and they were standing and warming themselves. Peter also was with them, standing and warming himself. So they said to him, You also are not one of his disciples, are you? He denied it and said, I am not. One of the servants of the high priest, a relative of the man whose ear Peter had cut off, asked, Did I not see you in the garden with him? Peter again denied it, and at once a rooster crowed. Now, Peter's story could have ended right there, but we see throughout the rest of the Bible that it didn't. And John tells us an important part of the next chapter in Peter's life in John chapter 21. This is after the resurrection of Jesus, and this is what we find. When they had finished breakfast, Jesus said to Simon Peter, Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these? He said to him, Yes, Lord, you know that I love you. He said to him, Feed my lambs. He said to him a second time, Simon, son of John, do you love me? He said to him, Yes, Lord, you know that I love you. He said to him, Tend my sheep. He said to him a third time, Simon, son of John, do you love me? Peter was grieved because he said to him the third time, Do you love me? And he said to him, Lord, you know everything. You know that I love you. Jesus said to him, Feed my sheep. Truly, truly, I say to you, when you were young, you used to dress yourself and walk wherever you wanted. But when you are old, you will stretch out your hands, and another will dress you and carry you where you do not want to go. This he said to show about what kind of death Peter was to glorify God. And after saying this, he said to him, Follow me. Now I think that when Peter mentioned that he was a witness of Christ's sufferings, I think that he was alluding to his own denial of Christ. And that must have brought to at least his own mind his restoration as well. Just as Peter denied Jesus 3 times, Jesus asked him 3 times, Do you love me? And then he told him 3 times, Take care of my lambs and sheep. This was Peter's call to pastoral ministry, and it was something that sets an example for all of us. You see, none of us is without sin. All of us need to be reconciled and restored to Jesus. Even the great apostle Peter denied Jesus 3 times, but he was restored. There can be a temptation for leaders to pretend that they're perfect or that they always have everything figured out. But Peter reminds us that even the leaders that we look up to need Jesus. We all need grace. We all need to rely on the power of the Holy Spirit. None of us can do this on our own. Whether we're leading in the church, whether we're leading in another context, or even if we're not leading at all of us need God. Now, I want to make one more point about the instructions here that Peter gives to elders before we move on to the rest of the instructions in verse 5. It seems significant to me that none of the instructions that Peter gives for elders are about preaching or teaching. There's probably some degree of teaching implied in the acts of shepherding and overseeing, but Peter doesn't dwell on any of that. He gives us a picture of leaders who lead by example. And this doesn't come long after Peter had given instructions for preaching and teaching. In the previous chapter, chapter 4, verses 10 and 11, Peter said, "As each has received a gift, use it to serve one another as good stewards of God's varied grace. Whoever speaks, as one who speaks oracles of God." So Peter did have instructions for people who preach and teach in the church, but he doesn't include it here. He doesn't include it when he talks about elders. I think that fits well with the instructions that Paul gave to Timothy and to Titus when he wanted them to appoint elders in the churches that they were helping to establish. In each of those cases, Paul mentions that elders and overseers should be able to teach, but the majority of the qualifications that he gives are about their character, not about their teaching. He doesn't emphasize their skill as preachers and teachers. He emphasizes what they are like. Paul also implies in 1 Timothy 5:17 that some elders wouldn't be active in preaching and teaching. He says in that verse, "Let the elders who rule well be considered worthy of double honor, especially those who labor in preaching and teaching." So taken as a whole, I think it's clear that the example that is set by an elder or a leader in the church is more important than their ability to teach. Their character should be the top criteria for their evaluation. Too often today, pastors who are gifted speakers are elevated regardless of their character, and there are countless examples of situations in which this has turned out badly. I think that the damage that has been done to the reputation of the church through the moral failures of pastors far outweighs the benefits of their skilled preaching. And so leaders in the church should care for people well and look after them in times of trouble. They should serve willingly and eagerly, not for money or for power. And they should lead by example. They may also preach and teach, but their example should be the most important part of their ministry. And that leads us to those in the church who are not in leadership. Peter directs his next instruction to those who are younger. But I don't think that what he means there is that he's talking to people who are under a certain age. I think that this is a differentiation between elders and everyone else. So this, I think, is for everyone who is under the authority of someone else in the church. Peter tells us that those who are under authority then, those who are younger, should be subject to the elders. I think this is an interesting way to frame this discussion. Peter doesn't tell the elders to take authority over those who are under them. He tells the youngers to submit to authority. The authority that elders have is given to them by God, but that the way that they are to be effective in using that authority is because people willingly submit to them. In general, elders don't have leverage to use in leading people. They don't lead by force or by coercion or by bribes. It's especially what Peter says here, that they shouldn't lead as domineering over other people. The only way then that they can lead is if people willingly submit to their leadership. So if I give you instruction in a sermon, I can't make you follow that instruction. But God calls you to submit willingly to such instruction. And if I'm doing my job well, then the instruction that I give comes from God and not from me. Erin preached last week here, but she isn't going to go door to door after preaching and check if you are doing what she said. She's not going to go around and check if you're building community. You need to choose to do that on your own. I ask people to serve by reading passages in church, or by giving announcements, or by running the sound and video in the booth at the back. But if no one's willing to do those things, I don't really have much recourse. Church leaders are dependent on the submission of the people they lead in order to be able to lead well. It's kind of like they say, you can lead a horse to water, but you can't make it drink. And then Peter gives us a final piece of instruction that is for everyone, and I think this is what brings everything together in a way that works. It's for the elders and for the youngers. And he says, clothe yourselves, all of you, with humility toward one another. Now this is what makes everything work, because elders who lead without humility, they will fail. And youngers who follow without humility, well, they'll find it nearly impossible to submit to someone else's leadership. Humility is a key component to the glue that holds the church together. When the Apostle Paul begins talking about the unity of the church in Ephesians chapter 4, he begins with a call to humility. He mentions humility in that context before anything else, even before love, which I would have assumed would be the first thing on the list, but he begins with humility. In Philippians chapter 2, Paul also gives us a picture of what humility looks like. He says, do nothing from selfish ambition or conceit, but in humility count others more significant than yourselves. Let each of you look not only to his own interests, but also to the interests of others. It is by doing that that leaders lead well and that followers follow well. And then Peter quotes from Proverbs 3:34 as he finishes verse 5 and says, God opposes the proud, but gives grace to the humble. This is a concept that is specifically from Proverbs 3:34, but it's a concept that permeates the whole Bible, and its inclusion here is very fitting. If we can't lead or follow with humility, our pride will put us in opposition to God himself. Now let me bring this together and close this out by telling you why all of these instructions for leading and following in the church are so important. Now I began by talking about football, so we'll go back to football to conclude. Just like a football team, a church needs leadership. We need people who serve similar to the quarterback on a team in order to help set the tone for us and to help to get us set for our individual tasks. Like a football team, we all have a part to play, and we all need to know what to do and how to do it. I need help with this more often than probably most of you realize, and I'm glad for our church board and the leadership and help that they provide me. But going further, imagine for a moment that our church is a football team, and on Sunday mornings we're all huddled up to hear the play from the quarterback, or whoever's preaching in this case. Imagine that after the quarterback calls the play, the team doesn't go line up to play football. Instead, they just clap and say, that's the best play call we've ever heard. Thank you for sharing that with us. That football team wouldn't be successful. But that's what it would look like if after listening to Erin preach last week, we all tell her thank you for sharing, but we never do anything to create community. If we don't do good to other Christians, like she instructed us from Galatians 6:10, then what good did hearing her preaching do? Or if after hearing this message today, some of you say to me on the way out of church, good message, Stephen, you've given me a lot to think about this week, but you never give it a second thought once you step out of these doors, what good is that? The church is full of important people. Not everyone, though, can be the quarterback. Not everyone can be the running back or the star wide receiver. Someone has to be the defensive tackle or the tight end or the fullback. Someone needs to be the kicker or the punter. None of those roles are insignificant on a football team, and none of the roles that people might have in the church are insignificant either. Some of us have to set up decorations at VBS, and that's important too. People think that kickers in the NFL aren't important. But in the history of the NFL, the most points have been scored by the kickers. In fact, Jerry Rice is considered by some to be the greatest football player of all time, regardless of position. And in his career, he scored 1,256 points. And that's more than any other player in the NFL who wasn't a kicker. But it's not the most points that anyone has ever scored. He wasn't outscored by 1 or 2 or 3 or 5 kickers. There are 40 kickers in the NFL history who have outscored the greatest player of all time. 40. Many of those are players that we wouldn't recognize by name or sight. But you know what? You don't win games without points. And nobody scores more points than those relatively unheralded kickers. They're rarely leaders on their teams. They have a very limited job to do. And honestly, they aren't paid all that well compared to other positions. They're certainly paid more than I am. But nobody scores more points than kickers. But you know what would happen to a kicker who thought that they should be paid like a quarterback because they score the most points? What would happen to them is they wouldn't have a job at all. If they demanded that a team pay them as much as a kicker, no one would pay them, and they wouldn't have a job. From the other perspective, a quarterback who insisted on scoring the most points on the team would also find that he didn't have a job either. Without humility, neither one would be able to do their job. And in the church, it's the same way. Whether you're a leader in the church or you have a role that occasionally goes unnoticed, if we can't fill those roles with humility, we won't be any use in the church. Even me, if I can't lead and preach with humility, I will be useless here. And that's because God opposes the proud, but he gives grace to the humble. Let's pray. God, I thank you for those in this church that you have gifted with leadership abilities and that you have called to serve this community as leaders. And I also thank you for those who humbly serve in other ways, that they follow well and submit to the leadership of those who you have tasked with leading. God, I pray that you would help me especially to lead by example and to lead in humility. Amen. If you want to stand with us, we will close with hymn number